right, cool. I think we're going to get started. We are going to talk about empathy today. My name is Drati Herpa. You can find me on Twitter at my first name. Shout out to my parents for amazing SEO. I get my first name everywhere. It's banging. I mostly tweet jokes. I work at Slack. I'm on the engineering team. I'm a back-end engineer, and I work on integrations and the API. We're going to start with a brief history lesson. This is Margaret Hamilton. She's a known badass. She was the lead engineer on the Apollo 11 mission, and she coined the term software engineering. And this is a picture of her standing next to the Apollo guidance computer source code, which most of it she oversaw and wrote herself. And she was 31 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and it was running her code, and it only landed successfully because of her really robust system. And she worked on all the manned missions and some of the unmanned missions. And she came up with the term software engineering to give software a little bit more weight. At the time, it was seen as this kind of like cool, magical thing that nobody knew how it really worked, and she wanted to give it the proper heft that she felt it deserved. And at this time, software was built more for doing machine stuff. I think maybe you've seen pictures of walls of computers, and it wasn't built for people. It was built for kind of these heavy-duty kind of machine stuff. So, I think the case of software being more for machines and people is kind of switched now. We're building more for people than we are for machines. So let's talk about empathy for our customers, for our non-technical workmates, and for ourselves. So this is not empathy, right? It's not about hysterics or experiencing high-intensity emotions. It's about understanding and sharing in the feelings of others. So Brené Brown is an empathy and shame researcher, and she's in Texas, and she calls herself a qualitative researcher, which I really like because it kind of shows that she's talking about the whole story, not just specific data points. And she defines empathy as having four main components. It's being able to see the world as other people see it. It's being non-judgmental. It's being able to understand somebody else's feelings and then communicate your understanding of their feelings back to them. Overwhelmingly, empathy is a skill, and it's really hard, and we can't assume that we're just going to be good at it because we're good people. There's an element of vulnerability, and overwhelmingly, empathy is a choice. We can choose not to be empathetic towards people. So sympathy, on the other hand, is characterized by a sense of distance and pity. And Brené Brown says that no empathetic sentence ever started with the words "at least." If someone comes to you and says, "I lost my job," and you say, "At least you know you can get a new one." No. Something like, "That sounds scary," or "That sounds tough," is a way more empathetic reaction because you're feeling that with them. So the key thing between empathy and sympathy is the willingness to open oneself up, be vulnerable, and be willing to kind of have some uncomfortable feels. And if we're able to be vulnerable and open ourselves up, we'll create connection. And connection is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And then if we feel connected to somebody, we can collaborate with them, and collaboration is what distinguishes humans. It's why we're apex predators. It's why we can live outside the food chain and have best friends, and it's truly red. So now that we have a bit of background on empathy, let's apply it. So I think I mentioned that software used to be seen as magical, and to an extent it is, especially to people who don't know how to build, a computer like we can. And we build things like apps and storefronts and social networks, and we want people to like it so much that they give us money. And software as a service is a thing in our industry, and I think the key word should be service, right? However, have you tried to use software you didn't build? It's really, really, really hard. And I feel this way, and I'm not what you would call a computer novice, but Google Hangouts gets me every time. And nobody here is born an expert, and I think we forget our learning curve. Flows are complex, and our familiarity with our particular software is born because we spend 40 hours a week working on this stuff. But what's interesting is engineers have a lot of disdain for users because they lack that familiarity. And that disdain can happen even when users come across weird flows in our products. Moreover, we call them users. That's not very empathetic. We should call our customers customers. Whoa, crazy. Because they're literally giving us money for what we're doing. And we should call them people or clients or guests just to kind of reframe, and realign our thought processes so we know who's calling the shots. Words mean things. Also, our disdain is really misplaced. Software today is really complex, and not a lot of the patterns are obvious. And it's getting more and more prevalent as software is in more and more things. So during usability experiments, typically the researcher can't interfere, and that's because they want an unbiased picture of how people are using our software. And I've definitely watched people use my software, and it's been like, no, don't do that, it's like a horror movie, don't go into that house, don't, it's like really, you want to protect them somehow. But empathy can kind of combat that. Empathy is a competitive advantage, and I think the majority of us are probably familiar with watching people use our stuff. And sometimes we can't ask people what they want because, they've become accustomed to kind of bad or imperfect flows, and, that kind of sucks. So let's look at a real example. Seamless is a food delivery service that's super popular on the East Coast, and they recently merged with Grubhub. And they recently released a new backend and a refreshed UI. And the reaction to these updates were really, really strong. It was a total who moved my cheese scenario, and customers had gotten used to one flow. And even if it's more efficient, they'd already expended the mental energy to learn how to get food, right? And it worked for them despite that. So we need to remember that familiarity is a more powerful concept than intuition. And we always want to make our software more intuitive, but that doesn't necessarily serve the people who already know how to use it today. All right. Another problem is that the groups building software are not the groups, they don't look like the groups that are using the software. And this is a problem, and it's one of the reasons that software development gets a bad rap. Let's look at an example of that. This is Apple's health app, and it came out in iOS 8, and it didn't come with the ability to track a menstrual cycle, which is hilarious to me because it's a huge indicator of a woman's health, and it happens, somewhat regularly for 40 years of your life, and it should happen somewhat routinely, right? So you can't track it. That's kind of a cognitive dissonance, You can track your steps, but you can't track this thing that's supposed to happen to you. LOL. So empathy, kind of combined with knowledge of this product, could have avoided this really huge blind spot. And they're going to be releasing this ability in iOS 9, but that's a full year after this thing was released. It's not great. So let's look at maybe a better example. So usability studies combined with familiarity can sometimes result in something cool. There's an old Harvard Business Review article about sparking innovation through empathetic design, and that's the idea that a company's employees have the context and the familiarity with the product, and if they kind of look at it through fresh eyes, they can build something innovative and stand out. So an example of this is the creation of a women's razor. Typically, women do not shave their faces, and so men's razors don't really work for them because we're shaving things like our knees or our, stuff that men are not shaving, and so we'll leave it at that. And this razor is not designed for that use case. And so a woman working at Gillette redesigned it, and they made a hilarious amount of money. And that kind of, combination of empathy and design is a good thing because they were literally already making razors. So we had that opportunity today to kind of look at our own products and kind of expand them. So let's talk about another example of how to build empathy. At Slack, everybody does support. We have 2-hour shifts, and it's really great because it builds empathy for our customer. We see the kind of things that they are struggling with, but on the other hand, it builds empathy for our customer support team. I don't know if many of you have done support shifts, but it's hard. It is really hard to keep your cool and answer a question, especially when sometimes it can feel a bit accusatory. And this is something we do. And Slack is 200 people, so this works for us because we make it work, but that might not be the case if you work at a larger place. But support can take all forms, and and not all the things we build are for our customers, so it's something that you can take in consideration. So moving forward, we can talk about empathy for our non-technical workmates. Traditionally, engineering is a real hostile department. We got a lot of power, not a lot of oversight. It's a real inmates are running the asylum kind of scenario. But how can we foster a more empathetic environment when there's a lot of departments that don't historically get along? For instance, engineering and marketing, we don't see eye to eye. You know, it's a real, like, feel it in your bones, pass it down to your children kind of blood feud. And I never understood that because they're literally trying to tell people about our good work. Like, that's what they're trying to do. That's their whole job. And so, same goes for sales. Whoa, they're trying to sell our work for money so that we can live our lives. Like, what? And it's not just those departments, it's product, it's customer support, it's other engineers, it's everybody, right? So why is that? I think it's because suspicion and mistrust come from not understanding what these departments are doing and not having any visibility into their workflow. Like, I couldn't tell you what a marketer does all day. But we need to start feeling empathy for these teams and treating their work as valid, just as valid as engineering work, because, you know, it is valid. For instance, like in sales, they'll often have quotas, right? And they have to hit these quotas, otherwise they lose their jobs. Like, it's so serious for them, and they feel that sense of like anxiety every day. And as engineers, we won't be fired for building fewer features per month. In fact, if we manage to compress a work, like a flow, and make it more simplistic, we'll probably get promoted. So at the end of the day, marketing, sales, customer engineering, or all those teams, they're interlocking systems, and we need each other to survive. So with all of this in mind, I want to talk about a specific interaction that I had with the marketing team at my last company. We convinced them to use Jekyll for the homepage. Jekyll is, this is amazing. I don't know how we did it. This is perfect. Jekyll is a static site generator written in Ruby, and all of the files are markdown, right? And so you have some YAML at the top of the file that like does a bit of organization, and then like whatever blog post as a body. And so we really sold them on this, and I wrote a dependencies script that installed everything needed both for Windows and for Mac. I was like, this is happening. And so we were all working in the same code base, both like the front-end team and marketing, and every once in a while, we'd add a gem they didn't know about, and they would see a stack trace. Do you remember your first stack trace? Was this not your face where you're like, oh, what's happening here? So like, this is kind of what they were seeing, and it's really, really wildly overwhelming for someone that doesn't use computers in the same way engineering does. Like, a lot of them had never even opened terminal before, and so they were just like, I'm seeing inside of the matrix, like, what is this? And I thought about that when I was trying to help them. I was like, calm down, like, they don't know. And so what we ended up doing was writing like a lot of documentation and doing a lot of training and a run book for when they did see it. You know, often they just had to run bundle. Like, so we just came up with strategies for working in the same code base. And the result of this is that marketing was seen in a really positive light because they did successfully use our workflow. And it engendered goodwill between the departments, lowered friction, and marketing got what they wanted, which was more blog posts from engineering. Because, you know, I can open a markdown file and write a blog post all day. I'll do it all day. So, you know, it was really great. Awesome. So now that we've discussed empathy for the people we build things for, let's talk about ourselves. I think within software we have a lot of problems. You know, what are we even building these days? I think there's a lot of trivial products. There's a lot of social problems, like women leave technology at a rate of 50%, right? And so there's also a marked lack of diversity in our teams, you know, and these problems are only going to become more pronounced as software touches everything, you know, as your fridges become smarter and your TVs become smarter, you know, like, this is only going to get worse. So we need to come up with an idea of how to build better software, and I think one of the ways we can do that is by making software development a no-flex zone. What is a no-flex zone? While it's like, I think it's ground zero for like fostering an empathetic environment. And No Flex Zone comes from a rap song by this teen brother duo named Ray Shremmerd. And it cautions against kind of an environment of posturing. And I'm gonna sing the song for you now. Sing it if you know it, you know. No flex zone, they know better. They know better. We do, we definitely know better. And it's kind of, you know, like a safe space. So let's apply that to our work environment. You know, is it welcoming? How do you treat questions that people ask? Like, is it a no-flex zone? Because for software to truly thrive, it has to be. So I've worked in flex zones where someone's like throwing around their weight and trying to be really cool, and it's really obvious because it comes from insecurity. And so I think that's silly. I think we want to be kind and welcoming and accessible. It's an empathetic thing to do. And it's also the breeding ground for collaboration. And I think software is becoming more collaborative, especially if we look at the success of tools like GitHub and Slack. And in hindsight, these products are built to kind of address something really obvious. And we need to think about how we disseminate information as well as how we do that, both for the actual information sharing and the tone we take in sharing said information. So feigning surprise when someone doesn't have the context or knowledge that you do is really alienating. And I think you endear yourself to someone when you take the time to teach them, as well as reinforce your knowledge set. At Slack, our principal engineers hold office hours every week so you can answer any questions that you may have. So you can just have that face-to-face moment where you can learn some stuff. So I'm going to talk about some collaboration ending phrases. For instance, you don't know what that algorithm is? No. I didn't come out of the womb knowing every algorithm. It's fine. Not knowing what a particular algorithm is fine. You can gain that knowledge. Oh, you're a smart girl. One, I'm a woman. Two, using an objective that's an adjective that's objectively true about me and then turning it makes me feel bad and not want to work with you. Another one is, we can continue to talk about this or we can fix it. And that's literally in the wild, that's something I've heard. And the reason I hate that is because, have you ever fixed a bug with no context? No, you have to know how to fix something before you can actually fix it, right? So we're gonna talk about a way that this can manifest in code. How many of you have seen a bug and you're like, oh, I'm so angry, get blame, who did it, who wrote this? And it's actually more like, oh, I'm gonna murder them, this is terrible. And sometimes I do this and it's my name, I did it, it was me, I was in the house. So blaming is interesting because it gives a semblance of control and we can get rid of our negative feelings, but it has an inverse relationship with accountability. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and the grit to actually hold people accountable and take it as a moment of let's work together. And it's interesting because you spend all your time raging and being upset and trying to figure out whose fault it is, as opposed to fixing the thing and working together and learning more. And blaming is really corrosive because it robs us of opportunities to be empathetic. So how can we build an empathetic code base? I think empathetic code bases have comments. They have a strong culture of code review. They have scripts. And they, most of all, they provide context. Comments are our first line of defense in building an empathetic code base. They give context to new hires, but also to ourselves. I don't know about you, but when I program, I'm a functional amnesiac. In the middle of the problem, I'm yes, I understand everything, I'm amazing, this is great. But in 6 weeks, I couldn't tell you. So comments lower our cognitive load by providing context where you need it, and that's an empathetic act. So let's look at some real examples. This is not a great comment. I've written this comment, you've probably written this comment, it probably is all over everyone's code bases, and all you can think is why is this so bad? I don't know. And we don't have context. This is unempathetic because we don't have context. So we can include a link to our issue tracker, and that, we can go to GitHub and there can be an animated GIF of what's going on or steps to reproduce. So this is a lot better because you now know where to go and look. So we can go a step further and we can add some accountability. If I know this is a hack, I can put my name on it and I can tell you when it's supposed to expire, and I still have a link to the tracker. But sometimes hacks are here to stay. So if it's gonna stay, maybe say why, and in Slack you can copy a link to an archive link and get more of the context there. That's the name of my podcast, check it out later. So comments at the beginning of a file are really helpful. They're both a welcome and also a warning. For instance, if I want to know more about time zones, cool, I can go to this website and learn more about it, but also I can know that there are lots of cities named La Paz, not just in South America, cool. Another thing that's helpful is if you're passing a hash, it could be helpful for you to know what's in that hash and what is or isn't optional. Do y'all remember the Hair Club for Men commercials in the 90s. You know, they're like, I'm not just a president, I'm a member. Like, this is something that I'm doing. This is like a screenshot from like our internal Slack. And I got a shout out for, hey, including a lot of information at the top of a file so that like, when this person went into the code base, they weren't completely taken unawares. And this is empathetic towards my workmate because he has that information, but it's also empathetic towards myself because now I can forget what I wrote safely, which is great. And I can go back and read my own comments, it's great. So provided that we have all of the information now, we can go and start doing a code review. And I think the process of releasing code is one of the most important things we do. It's the way we measure our output. But I think I spend more time thinking about how to solve a problem than actually solving the problem. And I've definitely opened pull requests not understanding what I'm trying to solve. But provided that we know what our problem is and that we've solved it, we need to think about our pull requests and, okay, I'm a little bit less. So yes, we open a pull request. I think the first thing we need to assume as reviewers is like do no harm. We want to assume good intent on the side of the person that's giving us code, but as like a reviewee, and as a reviewee, we want to assume that our workmate is doing good work and that they're not an idiot, and if they are, you know, they understand the problem. So let's look at this pull request. There's not a description. The title isn't particularly helpful. And I don't, as a reviewer, I don't really know what's going on in this code review. I have to go read a lot. I got to read a lot of code. I don't really know what's happening. This PR makes me do a lot of legwork. We can improve it by, you know, we can improve it by adding a description. We can say, like, I tested it. We can say what the risks are. And I can also call more into question with, like, some cool emojis. So now let's look at actually reviewing the code. We have to remember first, like as a reviewer, to assume good intent while commenting on individual lines. Because communicating is really, really hard. Sometimes it's difficult to derive like context from something typed in a text box, and it wouldn't be at all like something you would say to somebody to their face. And so when reviewing code or generally explaining technical things, we need to take ownership. We don't need to say, your code is bad, but like our code is bad. This code base, like all of it, you know? And we also need to eliminate things like just from our vocabulary, because just is really minimizing. You could say, oh, just re-architect that whole thing. Like, and no, that kind of minimizes how much effort it would take to do that. And so that means adding context to your thought process. Also, GitHub allows emoji, so you should use it because it makes kind of harsh statements seem less harsh. So now that we've kind of like started to release our code out into the wild, let's talk about how we tell people about it. Everybody likes good documentation, but people don't like to write it. And it's essential for reference and onboarding. Software is a complex machine, and it's composed of moving parts, and it's constantly changing. I don't know how many of you all have ever had your wisdom teeth out, but you know, when you're sitting like you've like come out, you're like not knocked out anymore, you're like listening to the nurse tell you about how you're supposed to clean your mouth, and you're like, I'm never gonna remember this. Luckily, you know, they give you all this information, but then they also give you like a stack of papers, and they're like, here, you don't have to remember any of this, you probably won't, like, look at this later. And I think we need to kind of do that for people. I don't know if you've ever worked on something without guidance or documentation, but when you deploy it, you feel a lot of anxiety because you don't really know how it works. I would make the argument that production code without documentation isn't ready to be released. And also talk about the idea of self-documenting code. There's this idea gaining popularity in the Ruby community that if you structure your code in a certain way, you won't need comments because the code will be the comments. And that is malarkey. Like, there's still a knowledge transfer that needs to happen. And I would wager, like, in these self-documenting code bases, there's like a higher learning curve. I recently talked to a girlfriend who's in one of these code bases, and I was like, how does that even work? She's like, oh, I pair program all day. And I was like, what? Like, you were literally every day, someone's giving you context with their mouth. Like, that's how that works for you. And I think it's important to have a code base that is well structured, but you can't leave comments out of it. Especially if you've ever used a library that's like self-documenting. If something breaks in that library, you're never going to have a chance to figure out how to fix it. And there's a lot of ways that you can easily add documentation to your code base. There's DocBlocker, which it's a Sublime plugin, so that you can literally just tap a few things and start writing documentation like right away. If you're building an API, there's this thing called API Blueprint, and it's generates JSON for you via Markdown. There's Docs.io, which has like a lot of L's in it, and it has like a simple folder structure and Markdown files that allow you to create custom documentation on the fly. So now that we've written down all the things, now what? We should think about the things that make our lives and our jobs easier. Can it be automated? Because if it makes your life easier, it's likely to make your workmates' lives easier as well. So at Slack, we don't have individual development environments, which is really cool because then you're not spending a lot of time being like, oh, why is this broken? And it also becomes like the responsibility of ops to maintain, which is like really great. So the way that we connect is like I have a branch, and then I pick a dev instance, and then I commit, and then like it gets synced that way. But sometimes committing, it takes like 30 seconds, but like maybe our syncing or SCPing would take like 2 seconds. And so it became this rite of passage that every engineer would work on their own script that would go from like my local to like the sandbox. But I'm going to tell you something. I never wrote a script. Instead, I did this a lot because I was like, oh, the penance, I'll write a script, it'll be great. But every file, I was like, SCP was terrible. And then we started doing this thing where we had like a CLI to like hack on. So now it's this. It's like, oh, I can just type Slack sync dev, and it'll like look at my branch, and it'll push it up. And this is really, oh my gosh, this is so much better. But there's more than just syncing dev. We can SSH into dev, we can tail the logs in dev, and we can also pull up a Beyonce gift if we're feeling fancy. And it's nice because you can hack on it in your spare time when you have downtime, and you can feel like immediately that you're having an impact on just yourself. It makes your workmate lives like more productive and more pleasant. It's great. So I think so far I've only talked about improving development processes internally. I think we can talk a little bit about external communication. And I think the way we primarily interact with other developers is via APIs. And we want to incorporate like other people's hard work into our stack. So the typical way that I interact with an API is by cobbling together like maybe the right token, maybe the right endpoint, and then trying to hit it. But I mean, 9 times out of 10, the response is like, oh, actually you did something wrong. And so I think what we can do is provide copy and pastable code that people can use right away to kind of get started. And this is empathetic because it lowers the learning curve, and it makes you feel productive right away, and so that you can kind of like feel like, oh, easy, quick win, and now I can continue coding. All right, so to sum up, empathetic code bases have comments, they have code review, they have automated scripts, and they provide context most of all. So, to sum up our whole experiment here, empathy is feeling with people. We build software for all kinds of people, and empathy helps us to connect to these disparate audiences. We have to choose empathy, and I'd argue overwhelmingly it's like the one thing that's going to future-proof our industry. Okay, so we want to remember that empathy is a competitive advantage, and it can help us stand out when choosing what to build and when we take people's actual needs into consideration. When we apply empathy to our non-technical teammates, we can end cycles of mistrust, and we can collaborate and get further than we would have otherwise. When we apply empathy to our fellow engineer, we can focus less on like time-consuming minutia and focus on solving the real problems at hand. I firmly believe that if we put empathy into practice, we can solve a lot of problems in software development, and working on these common pain points frees us up to work on cooler stuff. So go out there, make your workplaces a no-flex zone. We're going to build an empathetic code base, so get on board. Thank you. These are the people that really helped me with this. If you liked any of these ideas, any of this appealed to you, Slack is hiring. So any ideas or stories you want to tell me at all? Yes, you in the back.
Your observation puts in my mind about the word just.
Yeah. It's some real Inception stuff when you're like, oh, just do this, and you're like, okay. Oh no, there's this other thing that's broken. Oh no, this, it's, I don't know. Yeah. It's just recursion. Oh yeah, you'll totally understand it the first time you read about it. No. It's just software. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned to be more like that?
Well, I'm always going to be the first one to admit that I don't know something. I find that to be way more efficient because you're like, oh, I don't know how to do this. And I think once people see that you're willing to admit what you don't know, people feel a bit more comfortable admitting what they don't know. And sometimes it's like a coalition of the willing. Sometimes you can have like a partner that's like, oh, I also don't know this. And then it becomes this kind of critical mass of like not being terrible about it. Yes.
Very presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
But yeah, so as somebody who's currently looking now at the lives at a company I'm interviewing,
Okay.
your culture sucks.
Yeah.
You're not.
Sure. So the first thing that you should do is, after sirens and stuff, is if this. So well, so what you may want to consider while trying to figure out if the company is empathetic or not is try to interview with a member of their support team and see how they're treated. Because if they don't have a career path of their own, if they feel like people in engineering don't take them seriously, then you can kind of tell the overall health of an organization.
Do you find a common, it seems like everybody takes turns doing support?
Yeah.
Like, is that a relatively like rare thing?
I think it is. Unless, I've worked at places where if your customer support team uses Zendesk, you'll be pulled in when they can't figure out a problem. But it's never been like, oh, I'm just going to be a part of the support host and see what it is to work in their workflow. I think that's pretty rare. But you can suggest it at your companies.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
The thing you mentioned about comments, I've come across that. I'm a new developer. And so it's trying to be helpful.
Yeah. So if someone says that you're being too verbose in your comments, I just reject that premise completely. Because what if there's someone new that comes into your code base? How would they get that information? If they maybe want you to be a little bit less verbose, I would still argue for the existence of the comment, but I would say, in 6 weeks, what can you tell me about this? Okay, I'm kind of a troll, so I'd be like, remind me in 6 weeks to talk to you about this, and then I would be like, oh, do you remember what this code does? That's kind of terrible, but I would ask for, a way for you to be able to explain what this code is later, other than doing a hey, git blame and trying to find this person in later. Yeah, I would push back. That's nonsense. Push back. Woo,
In response to that,
yes, crosstalk.
I recently introduced code smell. As much.
But also, a lot of times when you're compressing code, the comments are going to be ripped out anyway. If you're in a JavaScript framework, you're most likely going to be uglifying your code, so those get ripped out anyway, so there's not really no reason not to have them. So, yeah, fight back. Yes, sir.
I was curious about the whole company and what was it a response to and how did it come about?
Yeah, so you're asking about the principal engineer's office hours. That came about because we had an influx of new hires and there wasn't enough documentation. So people were just confused a lot. And so my manager was like, well, we need an avenue for people to be able to ask questions. It's typically for engineering, but I don't think if anybody from any other department had a question, they could easily come in. And it's been really lovely. They've been tweaking the setup. It was twice a week, and nobody came to the second session. So now it's once a week, and the principal engineers alternate.
That's interesting because it spreads the pain around.
It spreads the pain around, and it spreads the knowledge around too. So I can get answers to questions that I need. So try it out. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you mentioned two things.
Yes.
Empathy is going to be the future, and also in 10 to 15 years.
I think it's probably been important all along, but I think we're coming to a real influx point right now in terms of like trying to extend more of a welcoming red carpet to people from non-traditional backgrounds. So I think we're seeing more headbutting than we were before, and also I think it's easier to kind of announce your displeasure at certain things because of Twitter, right? Like one voice becomes 1,000, to quote that line from House of Cards, if you've seen that. So I think it's becoming more important, more visible because we can talk about it more openly. I think it's always been a problem, but I think now is the point where people are actually thinking about empathy as an edge.
Because empathy, we should always have it.
We should always have it, but it's...
Even interacting with the comments.
Yeah, for sure. We should always have it, but at the same time, it's easy. It's hard because to feel empathy, you have to be willing to be open to feeling some discomfort and being uncomfortable. And I don't like being uncomfortable. I don't think you like being uncomfortable. So it's harder to open up your heart to want to do those kinds of things. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, I'll give you some time back. Thanks for coming.